You ever hear a story so wild it sounds fake, but the people in it are very real? Because what allegedly went down between Gucci Mane and Pooh Shiesty isn't just industry drama. It's the kind of situation that makes you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty in hip-hop. We're talking about a mentor and a protege, the label boss, and an artist who once called him family. Now, imagine this. One phone call, one meeting, one closed-door conversation, and suddenly everything spirals into something way darker than music business. But here's the part nobody is really breaking down. Standing quietly behind the scenes is Keyshia Ka'oir. Not just a wife, not just a public figure, but someone who's been controlling the narrative, protecting the brand, and making strategic moves long before any of this ever hit the internet. So the real question isn't just what happened that night. It's who made sure the aftermath played out the way it did. And trust me, once you hear the full story, your perspective on all of them might completely change. Before anything went left, before rumors, accusations, and federal talk started floating around, you have to understand who is really involved here. Because most people hear the name Keyshia Ka'oir and immediately box her in as just Gucci Mane's wife. And that right there is the first mistake. This is someone who built her name from nothing. No industry cosigns at the beginning. No music career to boost visibility. No famous last name to open doors. Just straight business instincts and consistency. Long before a lot of people even knew her story, she was already moving like a CEO, building brands, studying the market, and figuring out how to turn attention into money. Her rise didn't come from luck. It came from identifying gaps. She saw what wasn't being offered and created it herself. That kind of mindset doesn't just disappear when life gets comfortable. It stays sharp. It evolves. It adapts. Now, put that next to Gucci Mane, a name that doesn't just exist in hip-hop. It helped shape it. A pioneer in trap music, someone who didn't just make hits but built careers. Artists came up under him and turned into stars. His influence runs deep, and his legacy is locked in. But behind that success, there's always been another side people don't fully talk about. The pressure, the legal issues, the ups and downs that come with living that kind of life in the public eye. Over the years, Gucci has faced situations that would break most people. And through all of that, one person stayed consistent. Keyshia, not just showing up for the good moments, but holding things together when everything else was unstable. And that matters more than people realize. Because when you're dealing with someone who has lived through chaos, who has experienced both extreme highs and serious lows, the person closest to them often becomes more than just a partner. They become a protector, a decision maker, sometimes even the one controlling what the outside world sees. And that's where things start getting interesting. Because when people began talking about how Keyshia handles situations behind the scenes, it painted a very specific picture. Not emotional, not reactive, strategic. The kind of person who doesn't wait for problems to explode. She moves early, cuts things off before they get out of control, handles situations quietly but effectively. So when you hear that, and then you fast forward to a situation involving Pooh Shiesty, it changes how you look at everything. Because this wasn't just any artist. This was someone who came into the game with momentum. A young voice with energy, a sound that connected with people quickly, and the kind of presence that made industry veterans pay attention. He wasn't just another name trying to make it. He was already building buzz before a major push. And when Gucci saw that potential, he did what he's known for. He invested in it. Not just financially, but personally. Bringing someone into your label isn't just paperwork. It's a cosign. It's saying, I see something in you that the world hasn't fully caught onto yet. That kind of move comes with expectations. Loyalty, growth, respect. And at first, everything seemed aligned. The music was moving. The attention was growing. People were starting to connect the dots. Another artist under Gucci's wing making noise. It looked like a continuation of a pattern he had already established over the years. But what people see on the surface and what's happening underneath are rarely the same thing. Because behind every deal, every contract, every cosign, there are conversations. There are disagreements. There are expectations that don't always get met the way both sides imagined. And in the music industry, those small tensions don't just disappear. They build, sometimes quietly, sometimes unnoticed by the public, until one moment changes everything. Now here's where the timeline starts to matter. Because life didn't stop for Pooh Shiesty. His journey took a turn that paused everything. Legal issues stepped in, and suddenly the momentum he was building had to be put on hold. That kind of situation can either end a career or create pressure that builds over time. But during that period, something important happened. Gucci didn't cut ties. That's a detail a lot of people overlook. In an industry where artists get dropped the moment things go wrong, holding a spot for someone while they're dealing with legal issues says something. It sends a message, at least publicly, that the relationship is still intact, that the door is still open. And when Pooh Shiesty came back into the picture, people expected things to pick up where they left off. Second chance, fresh start, new chapter. That's usually how those stories are supposed to go. But not every comeback follows the script people expect. Because time changes people, experiences shift perspectives. And sometimes, what someone wants after going through a major life situation doesn't match what they originally agreed to. And when those differences aren't handled the right way, that's when things start getting complicated. Now, think about all of this from a bigger perspective. You have Gucci Mane, a veteran, a businessman, someone who understands the industry and how to navigate it. You have Pooh Shiesty, a younger artist coming back from a major life interruption, possibly seeing things differently than before. And then, in the background, you have Keyshia Ka'oir, watching, calculating, protecting not just a person, but an entire brand, a legacy, and everything attached to it. Because at this level, it's never just about music. It's about business, reputation, control. And once those things feel threatened, decisions start getting made differently. And that's exactly what makes this situation so much deeper than what it looks like on the surface. Because whatever happened next wasn't random. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a build-up, a series of choices, perspectives, and tensions that were already there, just waiting for the moment where everything would finally collide. And when that moment came, it wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It turned into something that nobody involved could ignore. And trust me, what happened next is where the story really takes a turn. So now you've got all the pieces sitting on the table. A respected industry veteran in Gucci Mane, a younger artist trying to re-establish himself in Pooh Shiesty, and behind the scenes, someone who doesn't move emotionally but strategically in Keyshia Ka'oir. At this point, everything could have gone in a calm, business direction. Conversations, lawyers, negotiations, contracts getting reworked the right way. That's how situations like this are supposed to be handled at that level. But instead, something changed, and it changed fast, because what was expected to be just another business meeting quickly turned into a moment that would redefine the entire relationship. The setup seemed normal. A call gets made, a meeting gets arranged. Nothing unusual about that. In the music industry, meetings happen every day, especially when contracts, money, and future plans are involved. So when the invitation came through to sit down and talk things out, there was no immediate reason to question it. From the outside, it looked like progress, like two sides coming together to figure things out. But behind that setup, there was already tension, unspoken, unresolved. And when tension like that isn't addressed properly, it doesn't disappear, it waits. It waits for the exact moment where emotions, pressure, and opportunity all collide at the same time. Now, imagine walking into a room thinking you're about to have a straightforward conversation, only to realize the energy feels different. Not open, not neutral, something heavier, something off. That kind of shift is hard to explain unless you've felt it. It's that moment where everything in your instincts tells you this isn't going the way it's supposed to. And once that energy changes, everything that follows moves differently. Because now it's no longer just about business. It's about control. And control is one of the most powerful forces in any situation like this. Who has it? Who's trying to take it? And who refuses to give it up? From what's being said around this situation, the The conversation didn't stay calm for long. Voices raised, disagreements sharpened, and what should have been a negotiation started turning into something much more intense. Because when two sides see things completely differently, compromise becomes harder to reach, especially when both feel like they're right, especially when pride is involved, and especially when there's more at stake than just paperwork. Now think about what that moment represents. For Gucci Mane, this isn't just another deal. This is someone he brought into his world, someone he supported, someone who benefited from his platform. For Pooh Shiesty, this could be about independence, control over his own career, moving differently after everything he's been through. Two completely different perspectives, both valid in their own minds. But when those perspectives clash without structure, that's when things spiral. And once things start spiraling, decisions get made in real time. Not always the smartest decisions, not always the safest, but decisions that people feel justified making in that moment. That's the dangerous part, because a single moment of escalation can undo years of progress. And from everything being said about that situation, that's exactly what happened. The conversation crossed a line, and once that line was crossed, there was no going back to a normal discussion. Everything after that became reaction, movement, survival of the situation. And regardless of what actually happened in that room, one thing is clear. That moment changed everything between them. Because trust, once broken at that level, is almost impossible to rebuild. Now here's where things get even more complicated. Because what happens in a private room doesn't stay private anymore. Not in today's world. Information leaks. Rumors spread. People start connecting dots, even if they don't have the full picture. And once the internet gets involved, the story takes on a life of its own. Different versions start circulating. Some exaggerated, some completely false, some mixed with just enough truth to make them believable. And suddenly, what was once a private situation turns into a public narrative. Now everybody has an opinion. Everybody picks a side. Everybody thinks they know what really happened. But here's the part people don't always consider. While all of this is happening publicly, decisions are being made privately. Real decisions, legal decisions, strategic moves that don't get posted online. And that's where Keyshia Ka'oir comes back into the picture. Because while the internet reacts emotionally, she doesn't. She evaluates. She calculates. She looks at the situation not just as a personal issue, but as something that could impact everything they've built. Brand image, long-term reputation. Because at that level, one situation handled the wrong way can have ripple effects across everything. And from that perspective, silence can be more powerful than reacting. Not rushing to social media, not feeding into narratives, but instead, letting things play out while preparing the next move. That kind of patience isn't common, but it's effective. Because while people are distracted by rumors, the real moves happen behind the scenes. And the truth is, situations like this don't just disappear. They evolve. They develop into something bigger, depending on how they're handled next. And based on everything surrounding this story, it was already heading in a direction that couldn't be ignored anymore. Because once a situation crosses a certain line, it doesn't stay in the streets. It doesn't stay in the industry. It moves into a completely different space. A space where consequences are real. Where narratives don't matter as much as evidence. Where things get looked at differently. And once it reaches that point, everything changes. Reputations, careers, relationships, all of it. And the craziest part? The public usually finds out last. By the time people start understanding what's really going on, the outcome is already in motion. And in this situation, that outcome was already building. Quietly, strategically, and getting ready to hit in a way nobody could ignore. Because what comes next is where everything shifts from speculation to something much more serious. By the time everything reached this stage, it was no longer just about a disagreement. It wasn't even just about a broken relationship between Gucci Mane and Pooh Shiesty. At this point, the situation had evolved into something bigger than both of them. Because once a situation crosses into a certain level of seriousness, it doesn't stay personal. It becomes official. And when things become official, the way they're handled changes completely. Now, instead of emotions and opinions driving the narrative, it becomes about timelines, details, consistency, what can be proven, what can't, and what actually holds weight when everything gets examined closely. And this is where a lot of people start to realize this isn't something that can just be smoothed over with a conversation or a public statement. Because situations like this leave impact. Not just in a moment, but long term. Careers get affected, reputations shift, and the way people look at everyone involved starts to change. Now, think about how fast everything flipped. At one point, this was a mentor and artist dynamic. A situation built on opportunity, growth, and mutual benefit. Then suddenly, it becomes distance, silence, and a complete shift in energy. That kind of change doesn't go unnoticed, especially not in an industry where people pay attention to every move. Because once something feels off, people start watching closer. They start asking questions. And even without clear answers, patterns start to stand out. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because while all of this is unfolding publicly in small pieces, behind the scenes, everything is being handled very differently. And this goes back to something we talked about earlier, the difference between reacting and responding. Because anybody can react. Anybody can go online, say something emotional, and feed into the moment. But responding? That requires control. That requires patience. That requires understanding that every move you make now will affect what happens next. And when you look at someone like Keyshia Ka'oir, that's exactly how she operates. Not loud, not impulsive, but precise. Because from her position, this isn't just about defending a situation. It's about protecting everything connected to it. A brand that took years to build. A public image that has already gone through ups and downs. A legacy that isn't just about music anymore, but business, influence, and long-term positioning. And when you look at it like that, every decision matters. Now, imagine being in that position, knowing that something serious has happened, knowing that the situation is being talked about from all angles online, and still choosing not to jump into the noise. That's not weakness. That's discipline. Because while the public focuses on speculation, the real focus is on outcome. And outcomes don't come from emotions. They come from strategy. Now let's zoom out even further. Because this situation highlights something bigger than just these individuals. It shows a pattern that keeps repeating in the industry, where relationships that start off strong eventually fall apart when expectations change, when control becomes a question, when one side feels like they've outgrown the original agreement. And instead of handling that transition the right way, things get messy. And when they get messy at a high level, the consequences are bigger because there's more at stake, more attention, more pressure, and more people affected by the outcome. That's why situations like this don't just fade away. They leave a mark on everyone involved, and even on the culture itself. Because every time something like this happens, it forces people to rethink what loyalty actually means. Is it unconditional? Is it business-based? Or is it something that only lasts as long as both sides are benefiting equally? There's no simple answer, but situations like this definitely make people question it. Now, back to the individuals at the center of everything. For Gucci Mane, this is another chapter in a life that has already seen a lot. Highs, lows, comebacks, reinventions, and moments that tested everything. So from that perspective, this becomes less about shock and more about how it gets handled moving forward. Because at this level, it's not about avoiding problems. It's about how you respond when they happen. For Pooh Shiesty, this moment represents something different. Because when you're trying to rebuild, every decision matters even more. Every move gets watched more closely. Every situation carries more weight. And depending on how things play out, it can either push things forward or create setbacks that are hard to recover from. And that's the reality of it. Now, for Keyshia Ka'oir, this situation reinforces something that was already clear. She's not just present. She's influential, not in a loud, obvious way, but in a way that shapes how things are handled behind the scenes. And sometimes, those are the people who have the biggest impact, because they're not reacting to the moment. They're thinking 3 steps ahead. Now, as everything continues to unfold, one thing is certain. This story isn't just about what happened. It's about what happens next. Because the aftermath is where the real outcome gets decided. Not in the rumors, not in the comments, but in the actions that follow. And those actions will determine how this situation is remembered. As just another industry fallout. Or as something that shifted relationships, perspectives, and the way people moving forward. Because in situations like this, time doesn't just pass. It reveals. And eventually, everything becomes clear. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not in the way people expect. But clarity always comes. And when it does, that's when the full story finally makes sense. If you made it this far, then you already know this isn't just another industry story you scroll past and forget. This is one of those situations that keeps unfolding the more you think about it. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Pooh Shiesty handled this situation the wrong way? Or was this bound to happen from the start? And what about Gucci Mane? Do you think he moves differently after this? Or is this just another chapter in a long history of ups and downs? And most importantly, how much influence do you really think Keyshia Ka'oir has behind the scenes? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. I read everything, and I want to know where you stand on this. If you rock with content that breaks things down deeper than surface-level headlines, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so